Severance is without a doubt one of my favorite shows to watch right now. And one of the main reasons is its stunning use of color. And this goes beyond just beautiful images, although the show looks amazing. It uses color in specific ways to help build worlds, establish characters, and reveal secrets, even before audiences realize it. Today we're going to look at the color theory of what blue, green, red, and a surprising fourth color represent in Severance, and then observe the patterns they form throughout the show. Let's begin. If there's a single color that I had to pick for its importance and prominence in this entire series, it would be blue. Now, blue is generally a great color in film and used across many different movies. One of the reasons is that blue generally complements a wide variety of skin tones to create a great looking image. But while other films use blue in their stories simply for the aesthetic beauty, Severance uses it to tell a deeper story. Blue is the core color of Lumen, and this makes sense at a branding level. When we look at companies involved in technology, healthcare, and biotech, blue shows up a lot. We see companies like Pfizer, Amgen, United Healthcare, Meta, Intel, IBM, all fitting into this blue branding. IBM is an interesting one as well, since IBM has a child company called Lumen, but Lumen is spelled with an E rather than an O here. Severance uses blue to represent Lumen, its power, and its ability to mold people to its will. It shows loyalty and conformance to the cause. We see this right from the first episode, even in the small details. As Mark walks Helly through the opening orientation, he's walking through a strict protocol in a popping blue binder. He's being expected to stick to the Lumen-approved script. Much of the severed floor also has these crisp white walls, leaning into that idea of a cold corporate setup. But even in the color grade, we see the introduction of blue tones to the neutral areas of the image. We can compare the behind-the-scenes images to the final product just to see how much these cool tones are introduced. Shout out to colorist Tom Poole for his work on this show. We can continue to build a case for this by looking at the floor manager's office. Bold blue, even in the carpeting. This room is a great example of the blue-toned world building. But this visual storytelling doesn't stop with the innie world. We see how Lumen follows and invades all of Mark's life. As he leaves work, we get a very on-brand Band-Aid, which boldly asserts Lumen's presence. And throughout the whole town, we are given this heavy, blue, depressing grade that just feels like we can never escape the tentacles of Lumen. In the first episode, the dialogue doesn't explicitly mention that Mark lives in Lumen-subsidized housing, but the world building established it so well, they didn't need to say it. You just feel like this is the kingdom of Lumen. My wife likes to poke fun at me for how much I love tiny details in movies sometime, but can we just appreciate these garbage cans? Look at how beautifully they fit into Lumen branding. It's these small choices in world building that just makes me so happy. Inside Mark's house, the blue also works on another level. Of course, it shows the reach of Lumen, but also leans into the depressing world of his outie. He lost his wife. It's feeling bleak. In art, we often associate blue with feelings of isolation and sadness. It's a beautiful dual use of this visual theme. Another use of blue in the show is to represent the MDR department. Due to the access cards needing to transcend both the innie and outie worlds, the cards are identified less by their markings and rather by their color. MDR is iconically blue. And we see this backed up in season 2 when Milchek references the outdoor tent color in season 2 as MDR blue. By the way, if you're a filmmaker and color theory is something you enjoy, I've put together a simple guide for the psychology of color in film. It's an overview of the most consistent cultural uses of color themes in movies, along with films that illustrate its use. You can get a free version of it with the link in description. Also, if you haven't subscribed already, make sure to do that. We've got some fun stuff coming up in the future. The next core color of Severance is green. The main use of green is as an additional brand color for Lumen. And we see evidence of this literally in the first shot of the series. Filling the screen is a gigantic green carpet. And we see a lot of the furnishings of the MDR area of the severed floor has this green impact. This blue-green combo is likely due to the heritage of the Severance chip. We find out that early versions of the chip had little blue and green lights. I like the choice of pairing blue and green for Lumen. When building a world, especially a world as stark as the severed floor, if there was only one accent color, I think things could feel visually monotonous pretty fast. For example, in this scene, the white walls allow for the space to feel empty and corporate. The green carpet not only helps provide a visual identity to the room, but the color bounces up to the ceiling and provides a hint of green to the top of the image as well. And Helly's blue outfit allows her silhouette to stand out in the scene. If we were to take away the green and reduce the image to neutrals and blue, I think things would start to feel visually monotonous pretty quickly. Another element of green is as the department ID color of optics and design. Which brings us to an interesting observation. Isn't it funny how the optics and design room is strongly marked by blue tones while their department ID is green? And yet, MDR has a predominantly green room while their department ID is blue. It's an example of how the two-tone system of color in world building can be helpful to still have a restrictive color palette, but allow visual diversity. O&D is another great example of the role a colorist plays in filmmaking. Look at these set photos versus the final grade. Do you see how much blue is the result of the colorist's work? It's pretty amazing. While blue and green often show up together, the second most important color of the show is not green, but red. Red is used to emphasize themes of rebellion, especially to Lumen. An obvious example of this is in the opening of the show. We meet Helly, who is a redhead, and her character is not one to quickly conform. She's consistently pushing boundaries, testing rules, looking for answers. Along with rebellion, we see red representing the world outside of Lumen's control, breaking through. In the opening credits of the show, we see the innie and outie version of Mark, with the outie version being portrayed consistently in red. It's often present as well to signify the discovery of new or secretive information. An obvious example of this is when PD gives Mark that red letter in Pip's diner. It stands out so starkly in the world that's being built. But there's also a beautifully subtle example of this in Season 2, Episode 3. When Mark is talking with Ragabi, trying to decide whether or not to go forward with reintegration, behind him we see some bokeh lights in a subtle amber color in the top right of the frame. But when the conversation pivots to his wife Gemma, the core question he's been wondering about since the OTC event, watch what happens to those little bokeh lights.
My sister talked to my innie. He said a lot of things.
Did he tell her your wife is alive at Lumen?
Who told you that?
Immediately those lights change to red. And this is no accident. Even in minutely subtle ways, the creative team is using color to elevate the storytelling experience. There also seem to be hints at a more traditional use of red for love or obsession throughout the series. That concept works with the previous example of Mark in the car, but there's also a great scene in Season 2, Episode 6, Attila, where we see Helena meet outie Mark likely for the first time in a Chinese restaurant. We know that she has been very interested in him, but outie Mark, not so much with her. Visually, we see this illustrated with a large amount of red in her angle, showing that obsession and maybe even love. But as we cut back to Mark, it's not present. She is into him, but it's not reciprocal. The final color I want to talk about is purple, but before we get there, let's look at how this color theory appears in specific patterns throughout the show. First, this color theory allows us to understand the characters at a more subliminal level. In general, we can tell a lot about a character by how they dress. If we just observe the MDR team at the beginning of Season 1, who is the one who is most bought into the mission and vision of Lumen? Who is the most loyal to the cause? It's pretty obviously Irving, and his clothes consistently fit beautifully into the cool Lumen blues. He's loyal to the company. He is a true believer in the mission. Dylan, on the other hand, is less of a devotee of Keir Egan and more someone who is willing to crack jokes and push buttons. And he often is one who appears in more yellows and warm tones in his costume. Mark finds a nice middle ground between the two. He doesn't push the boundaries all that much, but he hasn't fully drunk the Keir Kool-Aid. He's often playing it safe with neutrals and blues. But the cool thing is that costume choices can help emphasize a character's progression. Now, this isn't necessarily a rule that is always followed in the show, but you can see patterns that back it up. For example, Defiant Jazz in season 1 has Dylan reeling from finding out that he has a son and striking out at Milchek. The seeds of rebellion and revolt are brewing in MDR. And guess what? We see reds introduced in the costumes of both Mark and Dylan wearing dark red ties. Helly is also breaking outside of the norm with her bright yellow. In season 2, we see something similar. Milchek is trying to keep Dylan's innie in line by allowing Dylan's wife to visit him on the severed floor. The first time we see the two of them meet, we see Dylan in pretty standard colors for him, with the yellows and grays. But the next time he sees her in episode 6, he's much closer to those lumen blues and neutrals. And as a character, he's trying much harder to keep his job and stay in line. It's also worth noting that in the first visit with his wife, what color is Dylan's outie wearing in the pictures? Red. While all of this is great storytelling, I actually think that the most brilliant choice hasn't even been mentioned yet. Who has a wardrobe perfectly on brand with Lumen? Someone who has blues and greens that somehow work together perfectly. Helly. And of course she does, because she's Helena on the outside. I actually think this is some genius level storytelling, because her outfits early in season 1 are screaming how on brand she is with Lumen. I didn't realize it in the first watch through, but the second time through it was shocking how well this concept works with Helly. We also see a consistent theme throughout the show of red versus blue. This idea that Lumen's reach and power is competing with the outside world. The world of Lumen is very clinical, cold, and blue. But the first time we see Mark outside of work going to Rickon's dinner party, Mark is in a bold red sweater. We learn that Rickon and Devin are skeptical of Lumen, and the world building of their home backs this up. The red versus blue dynamic here is both specific, like in the red table mats, but also in a more general sense of warm versus cool tones. The walls are a warm wood. There are more browns and oranges, creating a world outside of Lumen's reach. This theme is present in other visual ways. Early on, we see Mark in the parking lot between a red and a blue car, perhaps signifying how he has yet to choose a side. He's stuck between these two worlds. At home, he has two fish, with one red and one blue. It's also evidenced in Petey's character. When Mark invites him to stay in his basement at the end of episode 2 and throughout 3, Petey is wearing a red and navy blue striped robe, leaning into this idea that there are these two parts of him competing for his mind. The storytelling of this dynamic is not only in the costumes and art design, but also in the lighting and the color grade. Take Mark's house, for example. Throughout much of seasons 1 and 2, we get a strong cast of blues and cool tones, just overwhelming the frame, because Lumen has him in their grip. But as reintegration starts to work for Mark, look at what happens to his house. We move from a wash of blues in the shadows to something more warm green. It's easy to miss this if you're not looking for it, but we are no longer under the thumb of Lumen. And this is accomplished not simply by art design, but rather through light and color grading. Now this brings us to the final color I want to talk about, and that's purple. So this one's tricky because it's a theory that has less evidence to work off of, but let me make the case and then let you decide. I think that purple is often used to hint at the crossover of the innie and outie worlds. And not necessarily as direct as reintegration, but rather these two worlds are getting mixed together. Here's some of the reasons why I think this. Conceptually, we are aware of the visual motif of red versus blue. But what if you mixed the colors together? You would get purple. The first time we see a character wearing something like this is in episode 2 of season 1. Irving shows up with a deep purple vest. And what do we learn about Irving in this episode? we learn that his severance procedure seems to have a leak. His innie and outie lives seem to have not severed quite right. We see him having hallucinations about gigantic black paint blobs flowing into his world. And we learn later on in season 1 that his outie is obsessed with painting the black lift hallway. There seems to be a mixing of the innie and outie worlds with Irving. In season 2, during the first episode back, we have purple break room chairs, and, while we didn't know this at the time, Helena has swapped places with Helly, once again mixing the two worlds. The morning after Mark and Helena are together at the outdoor retreat, the tent seems to be washed in a purple tint. We even see that when Irving left the drawing of the black hallway elevator, which he saw during the OTC that his outie was painting, it is left behind the purple break room poster. There are some other instances in the show where purple is used, and at this point, I don't think it is directly tied to worlds being mixed. Things like, in episode 1, we see an empty office in maroon and purples. You could make the case that that would be a department room color, and department room colors serve a different story function, but purple is something I'm actively keeping an eye out for because I think it has a foundation to work off of. Often when I talk about the color of a film, I'm referring to the color grading of the image. After all, that's my job as a colorist. And while the grading is obviously part of what makes Severance great, it's also more than that. It's the purposeful choices with color throughout the design of the show in all areas, from costumes to set design to lighting, color grading, that goes beyond simply a beautiful image, but propels the story in subtle ways that makes the artistry that much more inspiring. I can't speak highly enough about the work of cinematographer Jessica Lee Gagne and her influence on this project. Also, you probably noticed this, but she directed season 2, episode 7, which was just an incredible visual experience. A huge shout out to her and the work of colorist Tom Poole. If storytelling through color is something that you want to improve in your own work, check out my guide for the psychology of color usage in film. You can get a free download of it with the link in the description. There is so much more that I would love to talk about with Severance. Color theory is just super fun, but it's only scratching the surface of the visual storytelling. As the series continues, let me know if you want more content around it. I think there is so much more we can dive into. So what theories do you have about Severance? Any predictions for the future? I'd love to hear what you are enjoying about the show.